entire document on Ukraine separately. But the two issues are, of course, everything is connected, but we deal with one aspect of our tasks after another. This is building the international is broader than any passing conflict, important though those conflicts might be. Now, in particular, what the comrades have objected to is that they say that we say nothing of the struggle of the Trotskyists during the Second World War. And I find this, comrades haven't read the document properly and so on. There is, I'm sorry, I'm finding the quotes. Where it's got to. Oh, sorry, here it is, yes. In the document it says, so what did happen after the war? Why could a new international numbering millions not storm heaven and earth? And this is followed by this sentence. In the belligerent armies, the prisoner of war camps, even in Hitler's concentration camps and Stalin's labor camps, individual Trotskyists performed acts of sheer heroism. I think that is a clear answer to the point that we say nothing of the courageous activity of the Trotskyists during the war, but they were not an international. There have been many heroes of the working class at all stages of history that have made superhuman sacrifices and acts of sheer heroic courage. But an international is something else. An international is a movement in today's context. It's a movement of millions. It's got to be a mass movement. Otherwise, I mean, we have God knows how many organisations scattered around the world, little cliques that call themselves an international. Several of them call themselves the Fourth International. Why the fourth? I don't know. I mean, probably the 99th would be more like it if you count little self-appointed cliques of sectarians, if you would call them an international. But we don't have that conception. I actually, when I was a full-timer for Militant in 1974, we launched the Committee for Workers International. For better or worse, I invented that name. The implication of that name was one that we're not an international, we're a committee for an international. And that was a distinguishing mark against all the self-appointed groups who adorned themselves with titles that were a lot too big for them. And we also said a committee for a workers' international, and the implication there was a little reproach to most of those organisations who were largely at that time petty bourgeois in their class origin. Now that might seem a little bit too dismissive of them, and I don't want to sound, the last thing we want is to sound sectarian, but we do have to say that we stand against the sectarianism of any group which masquerades, which gives themselves the grandiose title of an international, which is not deserved. When we talk about even the first international, at a time when the international working class was a tiny fraction of the size that it is now, even then, it numbered at least, there are all kinds of different estimates, maybe 100,000. But in terms of actually in the imaginations of the bourgeois, they actually were so terrified by the foundation of the First International that they actually imagined, and they said, that it numbered 5 to 8 million supporters. Now that was, of course, completely exaggerated, but nevertheless, it was a mass force. I quoted in my document what the Times said, and the Times at that time was the organ of the capitalist class internationally, because it was the organ of the British capitalist class, which was at that time the only fully developed capitalist class in the world. And the Times compared the foundation of the First International to the birth of Christianity. That was the actual phrase they used, that it was such, it marked such a new turning point, a new springboard in the development of human history, that the development of an international of the working class, the development of a worldwide movement of workers that characterize themselves not by nationality but by their class and by their role in production. They call that as big a turning point as the birth of Christianity itself. That was what an international was even in those days. When the Second International was founded in 1889, Marx was no longer with us, but Engels was absolutely ecstatic, and he thought that that was the consummation of all their life work. He thought that this was actually the end of the struggle. He said when the first act of the Second International was the calling of a one-day general strike, a worldwide one-day general strike. It didn't actually work out quite on that scale, but nevertheless, it was another historic turning point. But Engels said, if only Marx was still by my side today to see that with his own eyes. He said this was the consummation of the lifetime's work of Marx and Engels. He saw that again and it was because we had mass parties, a real turning point of mass parties of hundreds of thousands in most of the countries of Western Europe and far beyond that too. When it came to the foundation of the Communist International, which was founded in 1919, but it was really began with the Russian Revolution in 1917. Again, it was not just individual commentators. It wasn't just the editorial writers or the columnists of the Times. It wasn't just individual outstanding leaders of the working class like Engels, but every worker and soldier in the streets of Petrograd celebrated the Russian Revolution as the birth of a new workers' international. They were consciously internationalist in their understanding of what it was that had been achieved by the taking of power. There are many quotes that have been given on that by John Reed, and of course by other commentators, by other visitors to Russia at the time, and of course in the archives, in the history. It's absolutely clear that the foundation of the Communist International, that they saw that again as the final consummation of the struggles of the working class over the whole of the previous decades and century or so. And therefore, for little groups now to masquerade as the Fourth International is really a bit of an insult to the memory of those founders and pioneers of the movement. So the question is building the international. How will a new international be created? Now, as I say, the French comrades they are very critical of us for saying that the Fourth International never actually materialized. When we said that it was an anticipation, it was a preparation, but the founding conference of the Fourth International in 1938 was not the beginning of an international. It was implicit in the whole thing. Why was it not called a founding congress? Because it was not a congress, it was a conference. It was really the best historical precedent or analogy for it would be the Silverman conference in 1916, 15 or 16, probably have to remind me, but in the time of the First World War, a small gathering of socialists who were preparing the way to recreate the international that had been strangled at birth, if you like, or strangled in the cradle by the bureaucrats of the social democratic parties. It was anticipation. Trotsky called it a founding conference, and it is not accidental that that there was never a congress. We're having a conference to win. That doesn't mean we're not calling ourselves a congress of a future workers' international. We're a conference of people preparing the way and hoping to chart the territory, to chart the map towards the creation of a real historical mass force. And I mean, when you look at it, there was a couple of dozen people gathered for one day in a suburb of Paris to hold the founding meeting. It only lasted a few hours. All they did is to, well, I say all they did, it was an important thing, but what they did was to approve the draft program of the Fourth International, the transitional program. That's what they did. It was a very important step. And we would not be here today if it wasn't for that absolutely historic, magnificent preparation, political preparation that was made at that time. And we don't diminish and we don't brush aside the importance of that, but it never became an international. It never became the international that Trotsky had envisaged would happen, because it's quite clear what we was talking about. Trotsky said, when he was challenged by the Polish delegation and also by Deutsche, who was speaking on it later, spoke on their behalf, Trotsky gave the decisive answer. He said, the disproportion between our strength today and our tasks tomorrow is clearer to us than to our critics. But the severe and tragic dialectic of our epoch is working for us. The masses who war will drive to absolute despair and indignation will find no other leadership than that which the Fourth International offers them. And he went on to say that in the course of the coming 10 years, the program of the Fourth International will gain the adherence of millions, and these revolutionary millions will be able to storm heaven and earth. And that's why we say that the founding conference was intended not as the proclamation of a ready-made new international, but as an anticipation and a necessary preparation for the wave of revolutions that would come after the war. Now, we discussed many times what actually happened to that. Trotsky's perspective, you know, nobody is absolutely omniscient. Even the most brilliant of our revolutionary forebears, none of them could anticipate everything and could see exactly how things would work out. And actually, it did not happen. I mean, we've quoted here the anecdote of Ted Grant, which I believe absolutely, because it's actually borne out by lots of written data, written references that we can refer to. But in 1947, he had a conversation with somebody from the remnants of the International Secretariat, and tried to discuss the new perspectives, the fact that a new period was opening up of development of a capitalist upswing, of a strengthening of reformism as a result of that, of an extension temporarily, but still for some decades, an extension of the power and authority of Stalinism and so on, and therefore the tasks of building a mass international had been put back by history, by years and decades. What our task is to prepare for the future. And the reply he got was, but it's still 1947. There's still a year to go. And this was the level that some of those people were putting forward, that they're on. Trotsky said in 10 years from now, that makes, what's that, 1948, we'll have a mass international. I mean, it shows the disparity between the magnificent aims and ambitions and tasks of the movement and the quality of some of the people who found themselves precipitated into a leadership position for which they were not properly equipped or prepared. So therefore, that meant that despite this heroic work, and as I say, the work that those Trotskyists did in the labour camps, in the concentration camps, in the prisoner of war camps, in the armies, the people who suffered terrible tortures and executions and massacres. But those heroes that fought there, they of course they need to be placed in the pantheon of heroes of our movement too, along with the workers of South Africa in 1973 and the victimized, martyred workers of Chile also in 1973 that we've already paid homage to. So these also deserve to be stored in our memory as role models and examples and heroes. But it was not an international. There are many people who do heroic work, and we honour them as such. We don't give them an appellation which is not commensurate with actually what their role was. Now, why is it that the Fourth International did not develop? We don't want to go into the whole historical objective background again. I mean, to some extent, it's dealt with in the document, and we've dealt with it many, many times in perspectives, material, and so on in the past. But you see, every international up until then was destroyed by counter-revolution. The first international was brought down by the defeat of the Paris Commune and the demoralization that set in, and the decision by Marx and Engels, first of all, to try transferring the headquarters to New York, and soon after that, actually to dissolve the international, rather than let it linger on in a deformed, degraded, distorted form, which would sully its reputation and its heritage for the future. So it was destroyed by the counter-revolution that swept Europe after the collapse of the Paris Commune. The Second International, again, destroyed by the counter-revolution, which took the form of the First World War, which absolutely crushed and destroyed what had been up to then the thriving labour movement because of the capitulation of its leaders. Counter-revolution once again. Third International, also a huge, promising, rich, new beginning with all kinds of promise, also destroyed by the counter-revolution in the sense of the bureaucratic Stalinist counter-revolution in Russia, which was aided and abetted and accelerated by the victory of the counter-revolution in Germany under Hitler, in Italy under Mussolini, in Spain with the defeat of the Spanish Civil War, and so on. Every one of those internationals has been destroyed by counter-revolution. So what happens with the embryonic germ of a Fourth International that existed at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War? Well, first of all, the war itself, of course, dislocated and destroyed large elements of the traditions of the working class. But more important, I think there's a very important phrase which we perhaps don't use enough, which is a phrase that Ted Grant came up with to describe what happened after the Second World War. And it's one that at the time I probably hadn't quite understood what he meant, because it has a certain kind of mysterious overtone. But when you look back at it, it's absolutely crystal clear. It's the most precise description of what happened. Ted Grant said what happened with the movements after the Second World War was counter-revolution in a democratic form. There was a counter-revolution. The incipient revolution was breaking out in the mutinous armies, in the Popular Front governments that were set up, in the mass movements of radicalisation. For instance, with the election on a landslide majority of the first majority Labour government in Britain, and several other things. But it was counter-revolution because it destroyed that revolution in a democratic form. What you got was not dictatorship, not Bonapartism, not fascism, and so on, but we got democratic regimes which nevertheless completely destroyed the revolutionary germ and actually put back the revolution as we've seen, at least as far as the developed countries of the world are concerned, by decades. That is what happened, and that's why. What are the tasks now? The Fourth International, as I say, as a result of that, it failed to materialise. It remains only a blueprint, and its scattered fragments disintegrated thereafter into sectarian, little sectarian rival sects. But it's not just a question now that the movement is once again on the move. It's not a question of just resuming where we left off in 1945. And that, I think, is the mistake that is made by most of the self-styled Fourth Internationals or Trotskyist organizations around the world, that they think the link has been tied to 1938 and that we resume again on that basis. But actually, what we have to understand is that we're in an entirely new stage of the history of the working class and of world history, that a new epoch has begun. Because the important thing, which is not, I have not seen any reasonable or sufficient or adequate attention given to it by any of the left groups, apart from us in WIN, and that is that the complete remodeling, the complete reconstruction of the working class in the period since then, the relocation of industry through globalization, which has transformed the world's working class. There's been, as we put it in the document, a hemorrhage of manufacturing jobs from their traditional locations in what is now called the G7 countries. Out of the world's 3 billion wage workers, for every one worker based in the countries of the G7 today, there are now at least 5 in China, India, Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In the USA, for instance, since 2001, in other words, in just over 2 decades, 1/3 of US manufacturing jobs have been lost. In Britain, the change has been even more dramatic. The number of manufacturing jobs in Britain has fallen from 17 million in 1960 to 2.7 million today. And that 2.7 million manufacturing workers in Britain today is the lowest number since 1870. We have less industrial manufacturing workers in Britain today than we had in, 150 years ago. The shift applies especially, of course, to industry. Again, another figure. There are now over 112 million industrial workers in China, and that's nearly 3 times as many as the 47 million in all the G7 countries put together. Again, if I can quote, by 1980, the absolute size of the industrial workforce in its traditional homelands had been overtaken by that of the previously underdeveloped Third World. Already by 1980, that figure had been overtaken. By 2012, the industrial working class in its traditional locations had shrunk from around 195 million at its peak to 155 million. But in the formerly less developed world, it had shot up to a colossal 500 million. That's 500 million in the new countries to 155 million in the traditional homelands of industry. All of these references are given in the document to that. Now, that has had both positive and negative effects politically. First of all, the most important factor of all, something that we should never, never, ever lose sight of, because it's a historic transformation. For the first time in the world, first time in history, the working class constitutes an absolute majority of the world population. That's an incredible figure. It's something which would have only have been dreamed of at the time of Lenin or Trotsky, or even a few decades ago from there. So the profile of the working class has completely changed. And that means also that its outlook and its consciousness have changed. Not that overall that its objectives and its outlook and its aspirations are any different from what they always were. But it does mean that the memory of the working class has been to a large extent excised, and the working class has to learn all over again, and is learning again day by day in the struggles that are involved in. I'm coming to what those struggles are in a moment. So therefore, in the West, as we say, the working class, the industrial working class, that is, has shrunk proportionately and in absolute terms. But has this meant a deproletarianization of the West? Absolutely not. Because while the size of the industrial working class has shrunk, those sectors of the population who were previously considered middle class have lost their former relatively privileged status, and they've become irreversibly proletarianized. We give the example of Britain, but I think we can do the same for any of the countries of the old industrial world of Europe and of the USA. The industrial working class has shrunk to a small percentage, a small proportion of the proletariat, of the working class. But I'll give the example of the general strike in Britain in 1926. At that time, the ruling class could still rally a mass force of jolly, jingoistic volunteers to wave the flag and keep Britannia afloat. They recruited strikebreakers from an inexhaustible pool of professionals, small business people, students, teachers, university lecturers, small shopkeepers. There was a huge residue of passive, at least, mass support for the ruling class. And when the general strike came, when the organised working class came, and it involved, I think, 4 million at the time of the general strike, they could be replaced. They were replaced by gangs, as I say, of flag-waving volunteers from among the students and the small business people and the professional people and all the rest. Nowadays, what do you see? Look at all the strikes in Britain at the present time. The biggest strike wave since the 1970s. And in that wave, who are the people involved? There are prolonged strikes today by teachers, by university lecturers, by hospital doctors, even by consultants in the last few days, by lawyers, by barristers, by civil servants. Comrades could add to that list. You can see they're now, if anything, among the most militant strata of the working class. Some of them have never been on strike before, but they're now at the beginning. And why? Not because of any kind of intellectual breakthrough but because of the conditions they're working. They've been proletarianized by capitalism itself because they no longer have a privileged status. Some of these workers that I mentioned there in that list are among the lowest paid and have the least security of employment of any workers in the country. And at the other end of the spectrum too, the new unions are springing up of what were previously considered a super exploited underclass, in the sense of the millions of casualized fast food workers, couriers, warehouse workers, taxi drivers, catering staff, office cleaners and so on, who actually make up a majority of the workforce in Britain and the USA. I remember looking up out of interest the characteristics of the proletariat in the USA. Top of the list, where it used to be, miners and industrial workers on the production belts and so on. Top of the list is fast food and catering workers. And they're becoming proletarianized too. They would never have been so in the past. It seemed like pocket money jobs, for the most disorganized people at the bottom of society. And now we have strikes of Starbucks workers, of McDonald's workers, of Amazon workers, and so on. All these formerly not even considered part of the proper, certainly not of the organized working class, who are now coming into action. So actually you have this amazing figure which I found hard to believe at first, but look at it. This is from the most authoritative social service, what do you call them, sociological data operations in the country, in Britain again. We know that in the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher consciously decided to destroy the industrial working class in Britain. That was the point of the miners' strike, when there was not only the mass closure of the coal mines, but also of steelworks, of shipyards. There's no independent British car industry anymore. The paradox is that that the only car plants in Britain now are owned by Indian monopolies like Tata or Japanese, which were formerly, almost, formally speaking, were not considered part of the first world in any way, in kind of industrial entrepreneurs. But we now see that there's been the collapse, as I say, in Britain, the shutdown of the mines, power plants, steelworks, shipyards, heavy industry, and so on. There were surveys done at the time. There was a survey in 1983, which was just at the beginning of that purge of the industrial working class. And at that time, they asked people, what social class do you identify with? And in that survey, 60% of the population classified themselves as working class. Now, the same survey was conducted now, that's 40 years later, and so they asked people exactly the same question, what class are you? And the percentage of the population that classified themselves as working class, 60%. Still 60%, exactly the same as in 1983. And that's because so many have become proletarianized by the development of society and by the logic of capitalism itself. And therefore, I mean, Thatcher had demolished the bulk of an already already dilapidated British industry with the explicit purpose of undermining working class consciousness and trade union militancy. And look at Britain today. A complete failure of that strategy by the ruling class. The social reserves are dwindling. The proportion of the population who classify themselves and ally themselves with the working class has not changed. Society has become, if anything, more proletarianized than any time in the past. But also part of that process is the absolutely historic transformation of the role of women in society. That in the past, women, of course, they always constituted themselves there was always a minority of the working class who were women, and they played sometimes a very militant role. Let's not forget the role of the match girls in the 1880s in Britain. Actually, it is a bit of a stain on the legacy, if you like, of the First International, that they called themselves at that time the International Working Men's Association. It's true that the women were not so big a proportion of the working class, of the organised working class at the time, but nevertheless, that is an expression, if you like, of an overhang of a backward consciousness even at that time too. But now women constitute a majority of the working class, and of course they're doubly exploited. As workers, they suffer the lowest rates of pay and job security, in addition, as I put here, to sexual abuse, exploitation and harassment. But in their traditional role as custodians of the family, they are also bearing the brunt of the cutbacks in welfare, in healthcare, childcare, youth services, education, employment prospects, and so on, because they bear the brunt of the suppression of the rights and the opportunities of the youth because of their role in the family, and that's on top of their role as being the most super exploited strata of the working class in industry as well. And then when we come to the youth, we see how they now are overwhelmingly in revolt against the establishment. Some figures, again, which I had to kind of rub my eyes to believe actually what I could see in front of me. And none of this comes from left or left-inclined organisation. They come from the solid establishment, social what do you call them? The social surveys of the establishment of the society, and the youth are overwhelmingly in revolt. And according to, in other words, there's the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a very right-wing establishment conservative body in Britain. They did a survey, and they showed that almost unbelievable result, that up to 70% of people under 40 in Britain explicitly favour socialism. Not just that they're left or they're radicalised and so on, but they were given an option. What's your opinion on blah, 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 and they gave different things. 70% said, yes, socialism. That's what we want. So they may not know what socialism is exactly, but that's not the point. The point is that they understand that there's an aspiration to build a new society, and they know that this society is absolutely rotten to the foundations, and it needs replacing by an entirely new system of society. And that's a very, very positive figure. But this survey of the Institute of Economic Affairs went further than that. They went on by saying, well, maybe you might think that this is just a question of, socialist measles, that young people always go through a phase of being a bit more radical, and of course, as they get older, they become more conservative in their attitudes. And they looked at the figures, so they looked at all the past figures, and they said, actually, no, that's not the case. There's never been anything like 70% of that age group that have considered themselves supporters of socialism in the past. And they even said this is a direct quote, younger people really do quite consistently express hostility to capitalism and positive views of socialist alternatives. And then it says, these attitudes may be a preview of mainstream opinion in Britain tomorrow. In other words, specifically saying that it's not the case. We cannot assume that as they grow older, they'll become more conservative. On the contrary, this is a sea change in public opinion, in public attitudes, that is going to continue. That there's going to be more and more a revolt against the society, stretching right up to the older percentiles of society. And we've also seen together with that the collapse in support for the traditional workers' parties in the West. Oh, by the way, I should say that in the USA there's a similar kind of figures, maybe not quite to the same extent, but in the USA, according to reputable opinion polls, among the younger sector, that's the ages 16 to 23, support for socialism, again, in so many words, has surged by nearly 10 percentage points from 2019 to now. That's in the last, 4 years. It's gone up from 40% to 49% of the younger sector in society have said that we want socialism. I mean, all of those figures together, the growth of the working class, the growth of radicalisation of opinion, particularly among the youth, but in society as a whole and so on. All of these are tremendously positive factors for us. And we also see almost probably a terminal decline in the support for the traditional parties of the left. Again, a few figures. The French Socialist Party, which I think only 5 years ago, it seems hard to believe, was still in power. They still had the presidency. But they won in the recent presidential and parliamentary elections. They, at least in, I think, in the presidential election anyway, they won just 1.7% of the vote. The Social Democrats' vote in Sweden, which was formerly, as I put it here, the reformist Mecca, it shrank from 45% in 1994 to 28.5% in 2018, which was their lowest vote for a century. And I think in the recent elections it went up by 1 or 2 percentage points, but no more than that. And of course, we have a situation now where in Sweden we have a government supported by a fascist party or by a very far-right racist party. Similarly, votes in elections for the Danish Social Democrats and for the Norwegian Labour Party have halved in comparison with their heyday half a century ago. The German SPD plunged from around 50% to little more than 20%, and it's now actually been overtaken by the far-right racist AfD party, Alternative für Deutschland. Absolute collapse. PSOE in Spain has lost 3.5 million votes and 13 percentage points since 2008. Of course, we had not quite a social democratic, well, it was really a social democratic party, the Euro-communist Italian Communist Party, which was once the world's biggest communist party outside of the Tsarist bloc. It's now completely liquidated, it just disappeared. And again, in Italy, a country, as I say, with such rich revolutionary and explicitly communist traditions, we now have a neo-fascist prime minister and government. I mean, it's a real collapse. And I left to the end the figure for Greece, the PASOK in Greece. And PASOK, of course, was not a traditional social democratic party because it had a very, very brief history. It came to the fore when there was a complete absence of any social democratic tradition in Greece before 1974. But because of the disappointment and revulsion, if you like, at the failure of the Communist Party, first in the Greek Civil War, and then later in the subsequent defeats at the hands of the Greek colonels, that because of that there then became a resurgence to the ex-liberal of Andreas Papandreou and PASOK, which became not just a social democratic party, but at the beginning, when it first arrived, it consciously said, Papandreou actually explicitly said, we are not a social democratic party, we are a socialist party. But of course, very, very, very quickly after that, it became a completely indistinguishable from the German SPD or the British Labour Party or whichever other example you want to take. But PASOK also, it lost 3.5 million votes and 13%. Sorry, that's the wrong figure of him. It'd been all but wiped out. So that was the point I wanted to make in Greece. Although, of course, there's been a certain resurgence now. Perhaps Andros could come in more on that. But a certain resurgence now due to the complete disillusion and despair with the role of Syriza. But anyway, all of these factors are important when we're talking about the political future. Generally speaking, we'd be very optimistic, but we have to build again almost from scratch because it's a new working class. By the way, there have been spasmodic and really foundering attempts by sections of the left, by sections of the working class throughout Europe to found alternative left parties, but all of them so far have fizzled out or been actually betrayed. We had what are the new alternative left parties, and that is a response to this thirst among the youth for radical alternatives, the phenomenon that I mentioned before. But we had Rifondazione in Italy, we had Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Die Linke in Germany, La France Insoumise in France, and a variant of that, which was the Corbyn upsurge in Britain. But all of those, once put to the test, every one of these parties have either temporized or vacillated or capitulated outright. And in particular, of course, in Greece, where Syriza won a general election, finding itself trapped in a head-on confrontation with the European banks, with the pressure of the masses pushing them onwards, and the forbidding response of the banks and the ruling class of Europe. They found themselves, they panicked, and they thought the only way out is to call a referendum, secretly crossing their fingers and hoping that it might give them an alibi for surrender, where they could say, well, look, we tried, look, we done it. When it came to it, two-thirds of the population, and not only two-thirds of the population, but two-thirds of every possible sector of the population, divided by class origin, by age group, or by previous political affiliation or anything else. A huge majority, 2-1, said no, we defy the banks. And the very next day they capitulated. The very next day, and an outright, conscious capitulation and betrayal, which was revealed. I think we should always quote this. Revealed in the memoirs of Varoufakis, who was the finance minister, or had been the finance minister for a very brief period at the beginning, in the early stages of the Syriza government. But he said, when the referendum result came in, they were all sitting, the whole of the government was sitting there, the television news was coming in, and they came up with the two-thirds majority to defy the banks. And Varoufakis was sitting there with Tsipras, and expecting. Oh yes, when the results came through, he said they were all sitting there. He said, I was surprised to find that the only person cheering was me. None of the others were jubilant whatsoever. They were grim-faced and miserable and didn't know. And he had a chat to Tsipras and said, well, what are we going to do now? And Tsipras said, oh, we can't do anything. What we do, if we defy the banks now, he said, we'll end up shot. He made a reference, a historical reference, to a previous coup against the left leadership. So we'll end up shot. So it was out of personal cowardice. What an insult to the memory of the hundreds of youth who risked death and many who were shot and mown down by tanks in their resistance to the colonel's regime at the Athens Polytechnic. And what an insult to the memory of the hundreds of thousands who sacrificed their lives in the Civil War in the mid to late 1940s. And that we see there from Tsipras, the so-called left leadership, who are just literally, almost literally, can we say, shitting themselves when they saw what the result of the referendum coming in. So all these isolated left groups have actually failed. But the driving force which led to their emergence in the first place has not gone. That was an early defeat. But let's see, sometimes when we see people who seem to be in despair, think, oh, everything is lost and so on. Look at the rise of the right, and there is. You shouldn't dismiss it at all, absolutely. We see a really frightening situation where we have right-wing, racist, even fascist or quasi-fascist parties in power in a whole range of countries in Europe. And now, in Finland and in Austria, of course in Italy, of course in Sweden, and so many countries, and on the verge, very likely, of coming to power in Spain and in Britain after a Islamic government, which will not maintain itself, in my opinion, for very long. There could be a huge resurgence of right-wing, far-right forces, which would be the price paid for the capitulation of the left in the whole of the previous period and so on. But nevertheless, this is not the end. This is the beginning of a whole new, well, it's not the beginning, but we're in the early stages of a whole new movement in society. And I'm not going to say any more. I've got a whole section about the left groups, the sectarian groups now. But I do think that we have to recognise something, that most of the far left groups now, if you like, we call them that, most of the Trotskyist groups or aspiring Trotskyist groups that exist today, they're cursed with the sectarian unwillingness to put the needs of the wider movement above the petty advantages of their own organisation. We came across, Karel and I are active in Newham Socialist Labour, and Karel will give a report on that. I don't want to anticipate what she's got to say on that. But one thing, and we also have Comrade Trish here, and it's very great to see you there. Thank you, Comrade. But we saw an example of that in the Socialist Party, or Tusk in Britain, which was, which is the CWI, what's left of it in its British manifestation, where we had a united front with them in the council elections last year, and at the very last minute, behind our backs, without any warning to us, they suddenly decided that they were going to put a rival candidate to our candidate for the position of directly elected mayor of Newham. And with the results, what did they gain from it? We got 5,000 votes, they got 2,000 votes. So all they did is split the left vote. For what? And what did they get out of it? What? Completely nothing but pure sectarian amour propre, if you like, egotism, that they wanted to say, we put up a candidate, we got 2,000 votes, without thinking of the wider needs of the movement to work with the left and to organise to participate in a proper united left or united front. And all of these groups, the mistake they make is they don't understand that it's no longer the task of 1938. It's no longer the task of simply of creating an alternative leadership for an already formed mass working class. It's not just a question, in other words, of just substituting themselves. It's that they're no longer, as I put it here, they present themselves as an exclusive vanguard, but none of them have assumed their long coveted leadership of a resurgent working class. And that's true all over the world, in every country, not just even in the European country. You take countries like Sri Lanka, where the Trotskyists I'm talking about 50 or 60 years ago, but they had a mass base, and they threw it away by joining a popular front with bourgeois parties, and middle class parties. But they've thrown away any role because of their sectarian attitude and approach. And as I put it here, that they've been bypassed by the class struggle, bypassed by history. They're left stranded like generals in search of an army. And that's really what it's like. When you see some of these leaders, they sit there doing their war games of how they're going to be, they've got to become a mass force, they'll lead the proletariat and so on. But then it's pathetic to look at them. They're like, like all demobbed generals, they war game their fantasy battles of the next war based on the strategic principles of the last, which is an occupational hazard that former generals are known to have. And that's particularly true of these leaders of, these aspirational leaders of the working class, because they imagine that all they need to do is provide a leadership. Now, the situation today is not that there are illusions in capitalism, not even that there are very strong reformist illusions, although, of course, that there's still an overhang, there's still some survival of that. The main thing is not that there's a mass illusions in capitalism. The problem that we face now is more, not that capitalism is worth saving, nobody thinks that, or very few people think that in most countries, but that they feel a lack of confidence in their ability to overthrow it. And what we need therefore, is to mobilize the forces and to give them the courage, and particularly to base ourselves, to learn from history and to develop a leadership all over again. They have a predisposition towards messianic pretensions, these groups. They put their own sectarian interests before those of the class as a whole. That's the example I gave, I think, bears that out. But their real curse has been their decades of isolation. And I also say this, that their isolation should not be ascribed exclusively to their mistakes. To a certain extent, you could say that their mistakes could equally be understood as a byproduct of their isolation, as they lash around in a futile search for a shortcut to the role that they claim as their historic birthright. So in Trotsky's day, the call for a Fourth International had an immediate resonance. So all these groups that call themselves the Fourth International, they might as well call themselves the Seventh-day Adventists for what it would mean to the working class. So what is the Fourth International? The Fourth International what? Is it a football tournament, or what are they talking about? It means nothing to say, we're building the Fourth International. There's even one group which is already written off, and they say they call themselves the Fifth International, the League for Fifth International. And then you think, why fifth? Why fifth? If you're counting all of them as internationals, then it goes into the hundreds. Never mind to five. I mean, it means it. The point is, it had a resonance. In 1938, when Trotsky said we need to build a Fourth International, that meant everything to millions, not to millions maybe, but to thousands or hundreds of thousands of active, organised vanguard workers, because they were already members of organisations which claimed allegiance to the Second International or the Third International. And when he went to them and said we need a Fourth International, that made sense. You mean that those internationals no longer fit the bill, they no longer serve their appointed purpose, and therefore we need to try again and start again. But to say now fourth or fifth or any other international, we have to start again. We have to explain what we need is an international. What we need is for the working class to work together. And so I don't want to say any more about the left groups, but finishing on this point really, how is a new international to be built? Of course, there's no magic solutions. We can only go by certain guiding principles. But let's remember, how did Marx and Engels approach the task, and how did Lenin and Trotsky approach the task too? It may sound, to talk about the project of a single party of the world working class today might look a little bit far-fetched, but it didn't seem like that. As I said, it didn't seem like that to the representatives of the ruling class in Britain, who called it the foundation of the First International equivalent to the birth of Christianity. It didn't seem a chimera or out of the reach to the workers and soldiers of Petrograd when they said we're now going to storm the world, we're now going to take over the world, spread the revolution. When the workers on the street challenged John Reed at the time and said, right, now call on the workers of America to take power there, we'll build a new world. That was the workers and soldiers on the street were so clear about what the meaning of what they were doing. So talking about a new international is not a pipe dream, it's not a utopia. So how do we do it? How did Marx and Engels talk about how they were going to create a new international? First of all, they worked with the London Trades Council. They actually, and it wasn't even, the creation of the First International wasn't even on their initiative. They were invited by the London Trades Council to participate, and actually Marx took a very modest and humble role at the beginning, where he didn't, I think the first meeting he went to, he didn't even speak, he didn't put his hand up to speak, although he'd been actually invited and was held in respect by the workers of the London Trades Council. But he thought, no, we'll let them find their own way. And as the struggle developed, that he began more and more to speak and to gain political authority, and by the end of the period of the First International, he was writing their manifestos in support of the workers of the Paris Commune. And so that's the first thing, work with the working class. What we all do in all the countries where we're based, we work in the comrades in Newham, if I can just give them an example, that was one model, but I mean, they run the Trades Council as well as Newham Socialist Labour. I'll leave it to Corel to give more examples of that, sorry. But I mean, that's the kind of thing, and up and down the country, and our comrades in all the countries where we have any connections, they're all working as modestly and humbly, but also with enormous effect within the working class organisations, with the trade unions, and the workers' organisations and what is left of the workers' parties around the world. So that's the first thing. The second point was that they worked to develop their political ideas. Theory, it was more important. The most important thing was to develop a clear perspective and a clear understanding of the way forward, so that the movement would be armed as it emerged, without the predisposition to blunders and mistakes and delusions that led them to defeat time and time and time again in the past. And finally, that they acted to put forward their ideas in writing and in meetings and so on. And by the way, I mean, we don't claim any, we don't have grandiose possessions or anything, but WIN has been organising over the period of the last 3.5 years, since the beginning of the lockdown. We've organised weekly meetings, every week, almost without exception, weekly meetings where we've heard on the spot, first-hand reports from comrades involved in the struggles all around the world. And I don't need to remind comrades that we have the biggest movement almost in world history of struggles. I can give some examples in a moment when I find them. One thing I wanted to quote, it's quite an interesting book. It's a bit academic, it's a kind of bit New Left Reviewish, but it's a book monitoring some of the recent uprisings and struggles around the world. And just one interesting figure that they quote from an academic, that according to one authority, his data suggests the annual rate of revolutionary episodes, that means in terms of uprisings and so on, it edged up from 2.44 per year during the first half of the 20th century. That's in that period of civil war, of revolution, of counter-revolution, of huge upheavals. The time of, I don't need to remind you what happened in the first half of the 20th century, but anyway, there was 2.4 per year. During the Cold War period, 1950 to 1984, it went from 2.8, from 2.44 to 2.8 revolutionary upheavals per year. In the period since then, this is the period 1985 to 2014, because that's the date, the date in which it was written. It soared from 2.8 during the Cold War period to 4.1 during the post-Cold War decades, and it's gone up astronomically since then. And the other thing which is of significance is that these revolutionary episodes, as he called them, are overwhelmingly now urban movements. That the revolutions of the past 4 decades have been overwhelmingly urban in focus, including, and then it gives countries that were traditionally you might have expected to be more in terms of peasant guerrilla movements and so on, including those in Iran, the Philippines, South Korea, Latin America, Eastern Europe, South Africa, Indonesia, Tunisia, and Egypt. So, in other words, there are movements of the populations in the towns, and that means overwhelmingly movements of the workers challenging capitalism. And I've got some more figures, which, if you just give me a moment to find what I did with them, but they are. No. I mean, the figures are actually quite startling. It is worth waiting for, I promise you. Okay, I can't find exactly the figures now, but anyway, there's a lot in the document on it. Oh yes, so here we are, I found them actually. And when we look at some of the recent strikes, marches, occupations, and revolutionary events of one kind or another that have swept across the whole of the world since then, since in the last few years, in the period since 2014, which is the last date of the figures that I gave before. But we see, from the Gilets jaunes protests in France to the strike movement, to the youth uprising there, to the heroic movement in Belarus, and I hope we'll hear from our comrade, our Belarus comrade, who I think will be participating today, who will be speaking more about the solidarity work that we have done with our victimized and persecuted comrades who are languishing in the dungeons of the Belarus regime at the present time. We take all of those, though, but according to the Washington Post, between 2006 and 2020, the number of protest movements around the world had more than tripled in less than 15 years. And again, another figure, another quote from the words of, again, a bourgeois body, because the ruling class monitor very closely about this. They have every reason to want to know exactly what dangers they're in. And so they monitor very closely upheavals and protest movements. And we use that a lot in our material. But look at this one. The Centre for Strategic and International Studies, which I promise you is not a sub-branch of WIN. They say, we are living in an age of global mass protests that are historically unprecedented in frequency, scope, and size. There has never been a movement like this, where there's the extent and the frequency and the scale geographically of revolutionary uprisings against the ruling class or against the government. It's never been anything like comparable. 1848 was a really real little local disturbance compared to what has been happening now on every continent of the globe. And in that situation, we have all the possibilities to build the basis for an international. And how do we do that? We do that not primarily by preaching, but never by preaching. But of course, we offer our ideas. We monitor what's going on. We try to develop a theory and a way forward with some ideas and so on. But mainly by listening, by actually keeping our finger on the pulse and seeing what is actually happening. And that was the mark. I'm always finishing on that. I know I've gone on a long time. But that was the mark of the great revolutionaries of the past. We've quoted this many times, but I think let's remind ourselves. The need for the working class to smash the existing organizations of the state and to create their own new organizations of their own was not something that Marx taught. It's not, he didn't come and as a preconceived formula to tell people how to do it. It's something that he learned from the experience of the workers in the Paris Commune. And he wrote in his pamphlets on the experience of the Paris Commune, he said, we learned from them that you need to smash the old state machine, that you can't use, that the state is not a neutral body, it can't be turned from the service of the bourgeoisie to the service of the proletariat. We need to smash that and to create our own. And he developed all the formulae, which later became the formulae of the Bolsheviks in relation to the Russian Revolution in the formation of the Soviets. The Soviets themselves, the Bolsheviks initially in Petrograd, in St. Petersburg as it then was, in 1905, when the workers formed Soviets, of which Trotsky was the leader, the local Bolsheviks thought, oh, no, this is challenging the leading role of the party. We can't have that. And it was Lenin convinced them and said, no, the Soviet is the organ of proletarian rule, and we have to support it. And in fact, when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, it is not accidental. It was not led in the name of the Bolshevik Party. It was led in the name of the Soviets, because they were the organs of workers' power, and so on. And that was something, again, learning from the working class. There are many, many examples, some of which have been given in this document here, where the role of the leadership was precisely to keep finger on the pulse, to listen, to keep an ear to the ground, see what is happening, monitor what is happening, and then formulate conclusions based on that and generalize them and spread them to the working class. So I'll just, there's obviously a lot more to be said, and I'm not going to, I promise you, I'm going to resist the temptation to say any more now on that. But I'd just like to say one thing. This conference, of course, we don't make grandiose claims or pretensions and so on. This is a tiny meeting. We've got a handful of, even where we're strongest, we're only a handful of people. We have, great achievements have been done. For instance, the Swedish comrades, who for, I don't know, is it 10 or 20 years or what, have had a presence on the council, the local council, Umeå, and are reckoned and understood as an independent revolutionary party. It is of its own status within that city of Umeå, but only within Umeå so far. It's not a Swedish, not yet even a Swedish tendency. The same with all the groups. I'm sure that all the comrades here would say the same. That what we're doing is building a model, building a microcosm of what could be done in future. And I think that we've done very well. At this meeting, on my reckoning, there's somewhere between 15 and 20 countries that have been represented, either here, of course, not very many, but online. And that's if you include also solidarity greetings messages that we received from different countries too. And there's some video recordings which are going to be played in the course of this session too. So I think we've made a modest beginning, and we must continue on that basis. But the first thing is to keep our principles intact. And as I say at the end of the document, there is plenty of steam. If you like, when Trotsky said that it's not the piston which drives the mechanism, it's the steam, but you need the piston. Without the piston, then the steam just dissipates. But it is the steam and not the piston which drives the revolution. Well, if you look around the world today, there is no shortage of steam. And what we are trying to do, we're not the only ones, and we are happy to link up with other comrades who are trying to do the same thing, such as the comrades of International Standpoint that are here. But we are hoping to be able to create the piston by which that steam can actually result in a change in the world. So thanks, comrades.
Comrades, thanks very much, Roger. The applause, was really for the marvelous stock of knowledge and commitment which is locked up in those words. And I would really encourage comrades to read and read closely, the document, which I think is quite exceptional. I'll make some points about that. Which Roger maybe didn't want to repeat because he assumes we are entirely literate and we've read everything. But let's repeat. Now, before we take a break, I would like to get indications of those who'd like to come into the discussion. So after our break, we start off in a very brisk fashion and we make the very best of our time. Sam, Pam, could you help me note people? Please put a hand up. I've got, I think that is Jan indicating. Is that right? Anyway, certainly the Swedish comrades. All right, there's one hand. Any other, the Matthews to come in? Well, look, please make other indications, but let's say at least we've got two to start. And please indicate as early as you can, because we don't want to have gaps, and we've got marvelous contributions which can be made. Please make them as early as you can so we get that interaction and that debate for which Win is so noted for. Right, comrades, we are now going to take a break. I was going to say 15 minutes, but please, let's try and make it 10 minutes. No Africa time here. So please, as soon as we can, let's convene again, and 15 minutes is the outer limit. 15 minutes, if I could be a nasty schoolmaster, is to say you're sitting in place ready to go. Thanks. Comrades, I think we are now reconvened, and I have the following list of speakers from the Swedish comrades to speak: Matthew, Carol, and David. Any other indicators, please put your hands up electronically so you are visible. If I could invite the Swedish comrades, I'm not sure who will be speaking, but I can see you sitting there and ready to go. Yeah. We can't hear you yet, but please unmute.
Well, hello, can you hear me?
We can now.
Thank you. Well, I will start by saying thanks to Roger for a very good lead off. We all know that there are steps that must be taken and problems that must be solved if we should be able to develop win. We all know that. I will give you some examples of the problems that the Workers' Party group are facing in Sweden. And I will start with the strategic formula that we are constantly discussing. Should our main slogan be that we are supporting the idea of a new socialist mass workers' party? Or should we support the idea of a new mass workers' party and leaving the word like socialist out? To be honest, we don't really know, and we have used both formulas. And that's, of course, a weakness. Well, nevertheless, what are our orientation? Well, as Roger said, the question isn't today of just putting forward an alternative leadership for the existing mass workers' parties, for the existing labor movements. The question is, the problem is much bigger than that. So we are trying to orientate against the workers that are voting for three major parties: the traditional social democratic Labour Party, the former Stalinist party that have renamed itself to the Left Party, and also to the Sweden Democrats. The Sweden Democrats have to be taken seriously. It's not any longer a fascist party, but their biggest crime is that they are very consciously trying to split the new working class in Sweden. That's their biggest crime. They don't make any difference between Muslims in general and hardcore Muslims that support the implementation of Sharia laws. So while we are trying in every slogan, in every campaign to involve Muslims, and at the same time, of course, defending like women's right against Sharia laws and Sharia priests and that kind of political Islam, they do not. And they are constantly trying to split the working class by doing that. And that is their biggest crime. But we are trying to neutralize them in the way we can. And I will explain. You see, the Sweden Democrats, they have a composition that is very interesting. The biggest change in the Swedish political physiognomy has been the movement of workers from voting for the Social Democrats, the traditional Labour Party, to voting for the Sweden Democrats, which is a former fascist party. Now, they have four different components of their supporters, their voters. Old racists, even old Nazis, that's one component. The lumpens, the lumpen proletariat, that's another distinct part that votes for them. You have the biggest part, that's people who should or would historically vote for Social Democrats, the old traditional Labour Party. And you have traditional bourgeois voters, often careerists, that see in the Sweden Democrats a fast way of making a career, and they often do. Now, these are the basic components of the people who support the Sweden Democrats, and they have in their interests are completely different from one another. The lumpens and the would-be social democratic voters that now are voting for the Sweden Democrats do not have anything in common, really, with the traditional bourgeois supporter. So their class base is very split. And the most good way of attacking the Sweden Democrats is to notice this and not trying to not dismissing everybody as a Nazi, because the conscious Nazis in the Sweden Democrats today are a very small number. So we get support in the local elections, and we have been, by the way, in the municipal council of Umeå since 1991. The people who are voting for us are people who should not vote if we were not present. Social Democrats, left party members or voters anyway, and even some Sweden Democrats and traditional bourgeois voters, because they think we have a good policy in the city council or municipal council. But this is the people. What do they have in common? Well, they are all members of the trade unions. So, because there is a problem with the strategic formula to support a new socialist mass workers' party or to support a new workers' party, what we do when we address the whole of the Swedish working class is that we are trying to concentrate on the trade unions. But to be able to put forward slogans of unity, we must direct ourselves at Muslims in general, but we cannot put down the struggle against the hardcore Sharia supporters. We must direct ourselves at the workers who still support the trade, the social Democrats, the traditional Labour Party, and also supporters of the Left Party, the former Stalinist party. Now, that's the sort of united front approach that we will have. And we are saying that the unions must adapt a program against the crisis, or even to go for a campaign to struggle against austerity, defending the elderly care, defending the NHS, if it was in Britain, National Health Service, and the workers' rights on the workplaces. Unite and fight for these things. We also turn to the Social Democrats and the Left Party, who constitutes a bloc together with two bourgeois parties. And we are saying you have to break with the bourgeois parties, the Greens, which is a bourgeois party, and a very liberal bourgeois party, which everybody would agree on. Maybe not when it comes to the Green, but they are very anti-union in Sweden. So what's our bottom line? Well, we put demands on the trade unions, and we put forward slogans that could appeal to the voters of these three major parties, a part of even the Sweden Democrats, because they should not be vote for them, and they just vote. They are not active. The voters of the Left Party and the traditional Labour Party. But you know, it's not an easy task. It's not an easy task. The orientation today to fill the gap, it's a very problematic thing. So the bottom line for us is our orientation against the trade unions. But we know that's not sufficient. It's not enough. We have a problem with a strategic slogan. And we would like to discuss, of course, not now. It's not the whole of WIN's problem. It's our problem. We can discuss that later together with comrades. But there is, as everybody here understands, a big step from having this conference with a very good lead-off from Roger, and to take concrete steps of more organized cooperation inside of WIN. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jan. Some issues which you'd like to take up further, particularly in relation to a program. I wonder if we, Matthew, could you now come in, please?
Okay, thanks, comrades. Thanks, and thanks to Roger for his introduction. I think there's really, in terms of the Trotskyism, which is what we're discussing really, there's some fairly basic questions, and of course the understanding of its own history, which has been gone into some in many ways, but obviously not always particularly honestly. Mostly people try to defend their own tradition. Normally there's this thin red line somewhere. I don't think there is a thin red line. I think everybody's been wrong much of the time. Some people have been right some of the time. The question is, how do we rescue the bits of right from the wreckage of the errors and and the mistakes and so on. The question really, is posed actually, of course, by the core of Marxism. Now, Marx, one of his initial great innovations, and something that's absolutely central to the whole process of and the method and project of Marxism, is that the working class is the sole agency for the liberation of humanity. That's its historic role. And as Trotsky observes, obviously in the transitional program which he wrote for the start of his for the Congress of the Conference of the Fourth International, that's the conditions are not merely ripe for socialism, have begun to get somewhat rotten. I mean, now, of course, all you can see is the smell and sight of social decay. It's everywhere, and the system is in gross crisis. The problem is really to look at, the impact of Stalinism, which has been the overwhelming force restabilizing capitalism since it took control of the workers' movement, particularly in the 30s, but most critically, actually, after the Second World War. Now, if you look at the situation after the Second World War, there should have been revolutions. There were quite clearly the conditions for revolutions throughout much of Europe, parts of the Far East, and elsewhere. And the reason that this didn't happen was precisely because of the Stalinists. And if you look at and you cannot understand current state politics in places like Italy and France and so on, even Greece, without understanding the role of the Stalinists in restabilizing capitalism and preventing revolutions in those countries. Say you can take the list of the crimes of Stalinism. You look even sort of the reaction of the Americans when with Operation Overlord. The one thing they were really, really afraid of was not facing the Wehrmacht or the German army. It was how did they control the French working class? Because obviously the resistance was fairly heavily armed, reasonably heavily armed, and had the experience of 1936, etc., behind it, was reasonably well organised. And how were they going to control it? The answer was, of course, the PCF. The same in Italy. The PCI was even more heavily armed. The partisans in Italy were, even more heavily armed than the French. And it was actually the agreement at Yalta of Stalin to hand all of these countries over to Western imperialism, to the US imperialism, and that the communist parties would play their key role in doing that and restabilizing these countries. And this is why, obviously, with that gross crime, that you wind up the situation where the PCI actually, after the end of the Soviet Union, collapses into neoliberalism immediately. And you wind up with the growth of the FDI, the Italian fascists, and the current Italian government. It's only understandable in those terms. In Greece, it's even worse. I mean, never mind heavily armed, they controlled the damn country. And yet, in Yalta, Stalin hands over Greece to the imperialists. And it's actually the Attlee government of Britain, which is an imperialist government, turns up, puts the British army into Greece and assists in the suppression of the Greek resistance. Is central to that whole process. Now, the problem, of course, is then for Trotsky is how do they understand that? The problem being, also at the same time, of course, what you have is a process whereby those countries are captured by the Red Army. They actually re-establish capitalism as well. Actually, they assist in the election of formerly bourgeois governments in all of those countries, with, of course, the Communist Party holding the key interior ministry and so on and so forth and maintaining control. But while Stalin seeks an agreement with imperialists. The exception, well, actually, Yugoslavia is peculiar because, under Yalta, Stalin handed over 50% to the imperialists, but of course they couldn't get there because the place was actually run by Tito and he wouldn't let them in. He wasn't that stupid. But the point was, even in Yugoslavia, actually, where all the bourgeois forces had actually fled the country, they had to import them, and they put them in the government in 1945-6. Now, the point being, then, of course, you have social overtones. You have social overtones. By the time, of course, it becomes clear that the imperialists aren't going to give anything and all the rest of it, Stalin decides, okay, well, you're going to have to change all this stuff. And there's the bureaucratic overtones in these countries in 47, 48. You know, actually, Yugoslavia is among the last. It actually trails, you know, when you have Yugoslavia, Poland, etc., etc. And, you know, also, of course, you have the tragedy of Vietnam, of course, in which the Vietnamese Communist Party is instructed by Stalin, via its handlers in the PCF in Paris, that it has to allow the French army back into the country, you know, which they control. You know, so that's ushering in 30 years of absolutely unnecessary war and the killing of millions. You know, and the last act of the Viet Minh when they hand over the French was to kill the Vietnamese Trotskyists. You know, the 200 comrades of the Vietnamese Trotskyist organization. So the question is, how do Trotskyists then try and understand that? You know, is it the case, okay, you know, suddenly these revolutions, actually social overturns are being undertaken by what is the counter-revolutionary force? It's a counter-revolutionary force, everybody can see. Is it the case then that this counter-revolutionary force is somehow given the task of being, you know, carrying out revolutions, and we're going to endure Stalinism for a whole period, and this is the way of life, and so on? Or is that job still in the hands of the working class? And what we see is most of the Trotskyists, actually led by Michel Pablo, as known and infamous, and which we should actually mention in this, absolutely, saying, well, no, actually, it's not the working class, it's the Stalinists, or in fact, bourgeois, third world bourgeois nationalists. I mean, Pablo himself actually goes on in the 50s and becomes part of the government in Algeria, which is, of course, a capitalist government, you know. So the point being, okay, what actually happens, of course, is that then there's, of course, the question, of course, is the dispute within Trotskyism. How do they actually understand this? Is it the case that the working class still has that job of liberating humanity, or is it Stalinists? Are we looking at, you know, generations of Stalinism and all the rest of it? You know, in Britain, of course, you have, you know, essentially, you know, the growth of Britain becomes key to the Trotskyist movement, obviously, because there isn't a mass Stalinist party in Britain. There isn't the repression. I mean, the key organisation of the Fourth International is the American SWP, really, in the foundation, because it has the biggest base in the basis in the working class, and doesn't suffer the fact that many Trotskyist cadres are killed in the war. But it, of course, then suffers the whole question of McCarthyism and is driven out of much of its base, you know, in the unions and so on and so forth, deliberately, obviously, in that campaign. Now, there is the problem in Britain, of course, is we look at, say, okay, well, the three people the three men, of course, who dominate British Trotskyism and have their names written on basically all of our pasts, which is Tony Cliff, Ted Grant, and Jerry Healey. Their reaction, actually, to the whole business of the Stalinists' overturn of power in Eastern Europe, etc., is to go along with Pablo, all of them. Apart from possibly Tony Cliff, although the problem with Tony Cliff, of course, is he proudly boasted of being an opportunist all of his life, and actually came out with the notion of state capitalism, that there was no difference between Stalinism and capitalism. Basically, he didn't understand either. So the
Sorry, Matthew, please start summing up. We're having more indications, and our time is going to be short. If you could sum up,
right. I think that, as I say, the key that, as I say, the debate was within the USSWP. Actually, the person we actually owe most to, and that, well, there's two people actually. One is a guy called Joseph Hansler, who was an Uzbek Jewish comrade, who unfortunately died in 1956, who started the work on the issue on looking at what he called structural assimilation and the process of counter-revolutionary revolutions by the Stalinists. And the second actually was a guy called Tim Wilforth, who happened to lead the Healyite movement in the US, but wrote a book on the question, wrote up the question of structural dissemination, which I can give people. It's actually up on the net. I can give people a reference to it. It's well worth reading. But it's actually to look at the history of the Trotsky movement and the failure of that. And you wind up with situations as say, well, the Trotskyists go off and say, okay, well, the job of human liberation is given over to, either third world nationalists and guerrilla movements and so on, which results in a whole lot of people getting killed in South America and all this sort of the rest of it for no particular gain, or to even into bourgeois nationalism. And there's a whole chunk of people, including people I know, who think that, there's some liberationary aspect of Scottish nationalism, God help us, or Catalan nationalism, or all this other stuff. And essentially, there's that
you've had 10 minutes.
So, yeah. Okay, all right, comrade. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sorry to stop you short there, but Carol, please come in, and you'll be under the same. With a little more generous, maybe.
Morning, everyone. I won't be 10 minutes. I promise you. I'll be brief. First of all, just a huge thank you to Roger for that lead off this morning. It was inspirational. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed reading the document too. And I wanted to pick out just a couple of things that you said about. First of all, about the survey in 1983, 60% of people pre-Thatcher identified as working class. Following that, the defeat of the miners, etc. And then 40 years later, 60% of people still consider themselves working class. And that is because of the proletarianisation within society of doctors, teachers, solicitors, etc. People understand their relationship to power and to the mode of production, and know that their power and their earning power has declined over those years. There's also a hugely positive view of socialism, and that really echoed with me because being involved in New and Socialist Labour in the East End of London, we do quite a lot of canvassing, we have street stalls, etc. And you see it clearly. People, Roger will bear me out because he's been with me when we've been in Canning Town, which is down by the docks and is perhaps the most working class area still of Newham. To the west of it is the old Beckton gasworks, where you're right on the river, and you've also, alongside big housing estates that are crumbling, you have expensive private flats, and you've seen the privatisation of public spaces. So working class people in that area particularly understand what capitalism has done to them. Capitalism has perpetuated by the Tories, but also the policies that have been pushed through by the local Labour council that have been in charge in Newham since 1964. It's never been anything other than Labour. So you knock on people's doors and you talk to them about issues that are really impacting on them. Housing's the big one, but also they see a huge decline in the environment, potholes in the road, litter not collected, rats, bed bugs, vermin, and very little hope, and having to pay more money for the same weekly shopping trip. So a lot of pain. And people will talk openly, and they've said it. We need a revolution. People say that to you. It is very, very heartening. And you can have really in-depth political discussions with people that, are just see themselves as ordinary people, with single mums, with older people, and with the youth, because the youth got nothing to do in the evenings because there's no youth clubs or anything for them. The parks are in a very bad state. So they basically sit on little bits of green chatting, and then when you talk to them, they openly talk about revolution. It is part of their, I think, what they live and breathe. So on the back of that, they understand that the Labour Party in the UK is not going to deliver that for them, and really offers them no hope at all. And I'm going to give you a practical example where the Labour Party in Newham, sort of representing the National Labour Party under Starmer, has done a real dirty on local people and how local people have reacted. So in 2022, in the council elections, we stood and we came very close to defeating them, and it really worried them. We stood in 5 wards, and we also stood for the directed elected mayor, and Roger mentioned that about the mayor, so I won't go into that. But we came within 100 or so votes of beating them, and they'd never had that before, and they were absolutely terrified. And of course, the Labour Party, because they're both West Ham and East Ham are suspended, it's been hollowed out. So there's hardly any activists now. Many of them are in Newham Socialist Labour. There was 2 by-elections in May of this year, and our comrade Mahmoud Mirza stood as an independent socialist. The last time there was a by-election in that ward, which is Bowling Ward, anyone who follows football knows that that's right by West Ham football ground. And we've had some very expensive housing put up there. And do you know what? It's got combustible cladding on it. That's the state of the borough. So Mahmoud, the last time there was a by-election there, the Labour one that's nearest opponent was 1,000 votes less than the Labour candidate. This time Mahmoud overtook that, and he knocked him into the ground and won by over 300 votes. So yeah, this is a very significant thing. It's not just about Newham, it is a significant thing. So I won't go on for much longer. I just want to just say that this is a trend that is gathering pace. Then by-elections, there's a by-election in Fazakerley, up in Liverpool on Thursday, with Comrade Jean Martin standing as a Liverpool independent. There's huge disillusionment, and we need to link up people across the country and across other countries as well, because we need to start thinking about this mass workers' party in a very serious form. I think the turning point in the UK is going to be with the election of Starmer. Then there is the real possibility, because there's going to be huge disillusionment. It's very hard to break the habit of voting Labour for a lot of people. They'll be looking for a change, and they think that change will be Labour. Even if it's crumbs off the table, it'll be better than what they've got, which is being fleeced by a bunch of gangsters. And people really in their bones understand that. So they may vote Labour, and Starmer may become the PM, even if it's under not a majority government. That's when the possibility of creating a mass workers' party really begins. Thank you, comrades.
Would you like to come up? Yeah. Just while we're waiting, please give further indications. I'm wanting to take the privilege of coming on, and Pam, you'll have to be select chair.
Hello, comrades. My name's Dave Hill, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to use a word which is much overused. I'm going to use the word inspirational, and it's inspirational to follow Carol with what she and her comrades have done within the community as socialists in their particular bit of the East End of London. And I'm also going to echo Carol, and when she refers to what Roger Silverman has written and his introduction this morning. I've got a confession. I'm not a member of the Workers' International Network. I've got a further confession. I'm a member of the Fourth International. But I hasten to add, not the revisionist bit of it, which is the English bit. I'm a member of the revolutionary bit in Greece, Octe Spartakos. Before I make a few little points, I won't be 10 minutes. I have to say I'm deaf, I'm hearing disabled. So if I repeat anything that anyone has said or misunderstood, you can blame me or just blame my deafness. The things that I really liked about Roger's introduction and about his leaflet was his description of class. Carol's referred to that. And in my teaching of sociology, yes, because of proletarianisation, people like me, teachers, lecturers, we can be sacked. Actually, I've been sacked from 5 of my jobs because of my trade union. But I'm not alone in that. At least I'm not in Colombia, where union and political activists get shot dead. And I've never been put in prison, but I've just lost jobs like many of my comrades in different countries. So I liked his emphasis on the fact that the growth of the global working class and the self-identification of billions around the world and the majority in Britain, and indeed the USA, similar surveys carried out in the USA. I also liked Roger's depiction of, I hope I don't sound too much like a Roger Silverman fan club, but however, I will end with a question to the comrades here. I also liked his depiction of the first and the second and the third internationals, and of course the classic Trotskyist, I'm a self-declared, self-announced classical Marxist and Trotskyist, his depiction of critique of social democracy, which always gives in, always gives in, always the reforms are taken back when the rate of profit declines, when there's a crisis of capital. Standard Marxism. I also liked, what Roger and Carol have mentioned, and I think one or two of the other speakers. What's going to happen? What's going to happen when Starmer's huge majority, I mean, yesterday's opinion poll suggested that Labour's going to get more than 400 MPs, the Tory, but the biggest number in history, and the Conservative Party in England will go down to the smallest in history, well, the smallest in the last 100 years anyway, down to about 90 MPs. What's going to happen when it becomes so apparent, not just to the disaffected, and the young, in particular, the young disaffected, the people who are on the Black Lives Matter march, the Me Too march, Extinction Rebellion march, marching in their hundreds of thousands in Britain and in other countries. But what's going to happen when, in addition to those already disaffected, then your standard Labour voters, your standard voters in the council estates and the private rented accommodation, what's going to happen after a year or two of them seeing that Starmer is actually a counter-revolutionary, that privatisation will increase? What's going to happen? Well, we know some will go to the far right. And we have a duty, don't we? We have a duty to present a different pole, a pole of attraction. We know that. That's why we're here today in all and around the world in all our different Marxist and Trotskyist and communist groups. Some will go, this is a problem. Some will go to the English, I was going to say the English Syriza, but it's not even that. There's a new group which has brought together a lot of other different groups in England, a new soft left group called Transform, who currently look like the biggest of the soft left alternatives to Starmer. And what are they offering? I was at a recent meeting where they said, a recent meeting of this group, Transform, where they said, don't mention the S word. Don't mention socialism. Don't frighten the horses. Jesus. What are we about if we are not proud to be socialist? We have to put forward that socialist analysis. I'll end up, one other thing I liked, very essential in Roger's writing and in his speeches, the curse of sectarianism. I mean, I've been stood for, and many people here stood in different countries for groups, such as Marxist groups, which are messianic. They believe they have the only answer. And as somebody said earlier today, they believe they put the interests of the party or the sect before the interests of the class. And that is a curse. I'll end up with asking a question, which I've already mentioned to Roger. So what then is the difference? I'm not going to say what have the Romans ever done for us. Roads, hospitals, blah, blah, blah. What is then the difference between WIN, Workers' International Network, on the one hand, and the Second International on the other hand? We all agree. I mean, both. I am not an apologist for the Second International. I happen to be a member. I'm not a leader. We agree on anti-sectarianism. We agree, as Carol has mentioned, on working, on linking with others, other advanced layers and advancing less advanced layers of the working class. So we agree on our opposition to sectarianism. I think we agree. We agree in our opposition to bureaucratic centralism, to the leadership and the machine knows best. And if you speak out of turn, you're out, buddy. So we agree on that. And we agree that we do not have faith in the Messiah. I'm not talking in religious terms here, I'm talking about the party leader. So we agree on non-sectarianism, we agree on non-bureaucratic centralism, we agree on not being messianic, and I would suggest we agree on basics of Marxist and Trotskyist analysis. So I'm interested to hear, but I don't have the answer. This is actually what's known as a genuine question. So what's the difference? And I think that should come out, that needs to come out of debates, etc. Comrades, thank you.
Okay, a verbal correction. Look, Comrade Sadara, I see you indicating, and you know, I see you. Please continue indicating, and please, any other comrades who want to come in, and I'd invite particularly Hewitt Bierkus from Namibia. We're looking forward to meeting with you in a very different ways. So please feel that the door is wide open, but I'm not excluding anyone else. If I could make some points, and Pam, please look at the clock. First of all, I have to commend and warmly commend the document on the history of the internationals, building the international. And, you know, I do think that we haven't really examined it as a document in the discussion. We've been giving sort of reports and so forth, and it does deserve a discussion in itself. And if I can say that one of the conclusions that I've read into it, more than it's been spelt out in a headline, is that obviously the compromised nature of the leadership of the Second and the Third International was their demise, but that war is a destructor of all working class solidarity and working class unity. And we're going through this period now of war, skirmishes, near wars, coups, every kind of way in which the working class is being savagely attacked you know, throughout the world, and being forced into uniform to die. And we stand against all of that, and yet we also allow everyone to debate. We are not moving into a kind of what you would say, any form of democratic or undemocratic centralism. We are open to debate, but we are committed to this, and it's well developed in the document. That of the particular contribution that the Bolsheviks made in developing a Marxist tendency and eventually a majority group, even though it was relatively weak and isolated, it had improvisation and initiative. It had, as Roger says, a kaleidoscopic variant of tactics and an open-ended discussion on strategy. And that's what I'm hearing in the different reports that are coming in, and I'm sure we're going to go hear more. But we are trying to replicate that. And as Roger has explained, we are going into a period where there's a, worldwide development of the working class on an unprecedented scale. I'm trying to just get a graph to show this, but it's a very combustible working class or a very combustible development. If I can get this up, unfortunately, the ILO is not the best when it comes to showing. If you can see that, what you do see is a line upwards. Unfortunately, it looks backward, it's reversed. But anyway, it is, if you can read from left to right, the line is upwards. That's the working class. But then there's a lighter line underneath, and that is the poor working class. I'll give out the details at another time on when. In other words, as the working class is rising, the number of working people who are poor, who are earning under a living wage, and in fact considerably under, is also rising. And that is a combustible issue, and I want to come back to that in terms of a strategy and tactics that we need to endorse. We saw the degradation of the working class, particularly on the periphery of world capitalism. We've seen the rise enormously of working class action, strike movements, and uprisings of various kinds. And I want to also weave into this the rise of women in defense of women, irrespective of their position in the working class, although that's accelerated or it's broken down the isolation of women in the home and brought them into production. But women, in terms of the degradation of society, where you've seen women prepared to go into the streets against machine guns in Iran because they refuse to wear their headscarf and so forth, and defying every day, going to parks and so forth, and refusing to wear those. And now in Iran and also in Afghanistan, they're closing down parks and so forth because they're women refusing to wear those. And those women are often beaten to death. It's an issue that the working class has to take up, as we are opposed to all caste formations, all class formations, or degradation of any form or any aspect of society. And we want no permanently oppressed section of society. And in fact, we look forward to opening, to have a discussion and communication with all groups who are resisting the brutal forms of patriarchy in the world. And we note that Trump and all the right-wing movements that we hear in Sweden and elsewhere are moving towards the control of women's reproduction and the denial of the rights of women. It's an international phenomenon from Iran through to the deep south of America. It unites the Muslims, it unites the Christians, and it's all barbarism of a new kind, and we fight against that. But it's also an indication that things are beginning to change when women are refusing to accept this. I want to point a little to the extreme polarization of society in this sense. In Zimbabwe, a doctor earns $100 a month. In San Francisco, and you may note the T-shirt I'm wearing, it's one of the longshoremen of the union, the ILWU. The dock workers there earn between $80 and $100 an hour, because they are organized and they are fighting. Imagine that. A doctor in Zimbabwe earns $100 in a month. An organized worker in America earns $100 in an hour. Now you're seeing the extreme degradation of all working people in the periphery of society and the enormous potential of organizing in those sectors, despite the nice word for it is authoritarian regimes. The better term for it is absolutely brutal regimes, which will shoot on sight people who are moving into protests on the streets. The task that we have, I think, as Roger has pointed out, is partly pedagogical, because as he points out in the document, there has been a lack of confidence of the working class. In other words, we've seen a hyper action, if we could use that term, in terms of activity, but the confidence that the working class can recreate society in its image is something which is lacking. And I think this is what we need to understand in terms of the work that we're doing. We need to put life back into the historical materialist view of society, going back to history. Oddly enough, it is often the nearest person to me, my wife, who reminds me of these elementary facts of human evolution. Actually, was basically not on the basis of changes in DNA and so forth, although that is part of its markings, but of cooperation in society, from the fundamental cooperation of society in the family, in wider units and so forth. And what we see now with the rise of the alt-right, of the Trumps and the rest of it, is an attempt to fight back against human evolution, social evolution, and the development of humanity. And we need to get that perspective so that the working class knows when it moves into action, it's not acting for itself, it's acting for the whole of society. I just want to touch now on the development, if I could put it this way, sometimes I feel that there's not a full understanding of the degradation of society. It's in the periphery of the world. Just let me give you an example. In South Africa, we are fighting against privatization, but are there public utilities? Every public utility in South Africa has been looted absolutely to the last penny by the national bourgeois. The leaders of the ANC and their families and so forth, they have taken the lot. They've subcontracted to each other and they've taken the money. They call that a public utility. Transnet, which we are organizing in Durban and elsewhere, has undertaken been a silent privatization. What does this mean? I'm calling it the silent privatization, where you see a Transnet is meant to be the public sector of all transport activities. In other words, mainly the railway system. They're employing 26,000 workers, but only 10% of the trains run at all. There's no trains between Durban, which is the major port, and Johannesburg, which is the major industrial center. No trains running at all. That is privatization, because now there are trucks with the directors' cooperation and the upper echelons of that public utility then employ their friends to have trucks to run that cargo from Durban to Johannesburg and back again. It's privatization. And there's a looting, there's actually warfare now on the road, because there's such competition between these different companies that they are burning drivers to death, and they're burning the trucks as well. It's devastation, and yet somehow it's working. It's called capitalism. Naked, brutal capitalism in motion. And now we've seen the formalization of privatization in this. Now, obviously, workers are not accepting this, and they are moving. In South Africa, we have something like 3,000 protests a year. 3,000 protests of the lack of water, of the lack of housing, of roads which have been, of the lack of libraries and so forth. Massive protests are taking place, which involve about 1 million workers a year, or maybe even more. The results are absolute zero. There is nothing improving in South Africa at all. No, reformers would be a lovely idea. It's actually degradation. Whole roads in the center. Johannesburg is the biggest city in South Africa, and its roads have recently exploded because the gas pipelines and so forth are blown up. The library is under armed control. I managed to get in there to be sneaking to have a look at the library doesn't exist. Every single public service does not work. Every single public utility is in degradation. Now, why I'm mentioning that is this is a huge, there's enormous development of opposition, to the existing order. But there are many other pistons apart from the piston of the trade union and the Workers' Party. No party, there's a party formed in South Africa every day, but there's no mass workers' party. There's no party which is even claiming to speak for the workers, because the trade unions do not want it, the leadership does not want it. The Communist Party claims to be it, but it's in cahoots. It's an alliance with the ANC, and it's busy looting itself. So everyone is making money out of the state, and except for the workers. I want to end on this point. We have this cruel contradiction that this mass upsurge is often not turning to the left. In fact, in the movement in South Africa, the movement to the right. In other words, you recently saw that there were the accommodation of immigrants. 73 workers were burnt to death. What was the reaction of society? Kill them all, remove them from society. They are the problem. The very destitute of Africa, the wretched of earth in Johannesburg, are being abused by other people, by the ANC in particular, who says that the answer to this problem is to leave the degradation of the city alone and to be able to expel the immigrants. And that is a theme which is throughout Europe. No one wants immigrants in Europe. And no official government, and often in society we see this development. So in other words, we have this contradiction of a huge uprising, a strike movement, a fight against the cost of living, a opposition to every aspect of capitalism, but at the same time a hardening of the right. And we have to face, how do we fight fascism is a theme I think we need to discuss in the future. I'm over my 10 minutes, I apologize. And I put myself back in the chair, if I may. And I conclude. Our comrade from Nigeria, Sadare, please come in. Please
Hello,
come in. Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Hello, comrades. It's been a nice discussion since yesterday, and I've been trying to follow the part of the discussions. Unfortunately, yesterday I was in a noisy area at the time, so I couldn't make contribution on the China and the other discussions. But I think it's important that it has been a fruitful discussion so far. In building international forces for a world revolution, it also requires the consistency and understanding the mood of the working people. But be that as it may, there is a new trend in Africa. There have been 2 coups in the last 2 months. In the last 3 years, there have been about 7 coups. Former colonies of the French are revolting through their military coup. Of course, the last coup in Gabon, ideologically do not link with Russia. But China and Russia imperialism are now in vogue, are now in trend in Africa because of the British and the French imperialism that has owed many African countries into captive for decades. So, but when we pay attention to many things that is also happening, the hypocrisy of the Russian and Chinese imperialism, we realize that there is no fundamental difference between what French and the British colonizers are doing in Africa in terms of their imperialist policy, dictating policies for their puppets in Africa, towards the Russia and China will be doing in the coming period, because China gives loan with little interest to African countries. The BRICS itself is a committee of, is going to be a new, because there is also the session where Nigeria, especially Nigeria, my country, is directly affected by dollar. But we are not sure if the Nigerian ruling class or many of the African ruling class aside the South Africa, we willingly wish to join the BRICS because of the fear of the US dollar effects. And you know, the crisis of imperialism has completely destroyed Africa. Majority of African countries will import practically everything from Europe, from America, and from China. The struggle that we have been waging in Nigeria and the other part of Africa, that's supposed to be anti-capitalist and anti-imperialism, with the struggle to fight for a working people's alternative, to build a struggle for socialism, has not been able to win majority to our sides. But as time goes on, we are hopeful that it will. Because what we have now, with the ongoing coup, with the emergence of coups, and the movements that are breaking out are lending towards Pan-Africanism. People want Africa for Africa. People think that when the British and the French are going, Africa can take, then they can get the support from China and Russia to save their countries, because nothing to show for Nigeria has been, since 1960, Nigeria independent, has been colony to the British. What we have is a neo-colonialism, because practically our policies, those who are in charge of Nigeria have always been subscribed to the World Bank, borrowing loans, spending it, corrupt top politicians, living a provocating style of lives and everything. So the situation at hand, the consciousness, the situation at hand require a class conscious and radical leadership. And the trade union leadership in Nigeria, even in the regional trade union, the ITUC Africa, International Trade Union of Congress of Africa, the OTUA, Organization of Trade Union in West Africa, and the others were practically not interested in saving African working people from the captive of neocolonialism, because most time, like they get support from US funded organizations, they get support from Danish government to run their unions at the regional level. So the crisis and the struggle before us in Africa, and I think also largely part of the world, is to have a clear leadership, class conscious, that is capable of leading the working people, the suffering people, for a struggle for a socialist revolution and towards the competition of socialist Africa. So communists, I wish us a full deliberation, and we hope to hear from each other as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Sodare. Good to hear your voice and to be able to see you too. Comrades, I've now got Comrade Timos indicating we will be closing at 1 o'clock. Well, I don't want to use the word closing. We'll be going through a transition, a transformation. We will then be taking lunch and returning to watch two important videos, one of which was from the Iranian comrades, and another one as well. Comrade Timos, please come forward and speak. Sorry? Do we have another? And another comrade, yes, Patrick. You'll be following, yeah.
First of all, allow me to thank Roger for his lead-off. I met Roger something like 50 years ago, and I loved his approach to politics, his speeches, and his the discussions with him. Today's lead-off vindicates my half a century love for Roger, because I think it was really great. Thanks again, Roger. I want first to make an addition and to extend a bit the question of the Third International. I think there is one defining aspect of the creation of the Third International that it has not been stressed. The Third International has been specifically built to carry out the ongoing world revolution, because that's how Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks saw it. And what they were building was not something long-term. They were building an army to carry out this world revolution. So socialism in one country was really the death knell of the Third International. The Third International had no meaning after that. If I were to summarize the duties of the various internationals, the International Working Men's Association was building a program for the working class in the world. The Second International was building mass parties for the working class. The Third International, as I said, is carrying out and spreading the revolution. And the Fourth International was built was attempted to be built on the predicate of the death agony of capitalism. And that's very important, because I think that today we have some similar situation. In 1929, we had the Depression, the crash and the Depression. We have revolutions in Spain and elsewhere which were defeated, and this ended in the Second World War. Today we have the 2008 crash and the following depression. We had the revolutionary movements like the Arab Spring, Syriza, Corbyn and Sanders, all which were led to defeat. And then we had a strange twist with COVID, which was used as an attempt to try out how control methods by the ruling class. And probably we are faced with a world war, in a sense, having started with the war Ukraine's war. We are, I think, living in a time of revolution. We should realize that. Revolution and counter-revolution always go together. We don't have much time. The capitalism is collapsing around us, and it moves in all sorts of strange ways, and we have to take into account. In this sense, our situation is such that we have the duty to carry out all the tasks of all the international's previous. The working class doesn't have a program. The working class doesn't have mass parties. The revolutionary movements are trying to develop, and we are faced again with the death agony of capitalism. The death agony which we don't know where it's going to lead. Roger mentioned that there is a change in the working class. Yes, there is a change, a huge change. There is also a change in the ruling class. I don't think that we can speak of proper capitalism today. We have a capitalism that is collapsing, if it hasn't already collapsed, and is becoming just a capitalism of a few elites who are robbing each other in various ways. And what they are doing now is trying to control society through through all sorts of manipulations. The media, high tech, the spy software. All of this is something that has to be discussed because it's not a stable situation. It is not a stable equilibrium. The ruling class stays there because these huge monopolies all over the world are manipulating governments, and manipulating elections, and manipulating almost everything. But it's not stable. Any time it could collapse. We should be ready for that. We lived through the collapse of the CWI. We lived through the collapse of the structures that followed it. And through that, I think one lesson that we should learn is that we should never again allow ourselves to think that we can speak of an international of small organizations. It's heartening that we are talking about networks, about discussion, about hammering out programs. But the first thing that we should understand is that we cannot talk of an international centralist party. This has to be done on the basis of workers' party, mass workers' parties in various countries, or at least in some countries. And so I think that we should be careful not to attempt something that is premature, something that is it could leave out the of the working class itself. The second thing that I would say is that we have to prepare our perspectives. We have to understand where this world is moving and where each country is moving. The second is that we have to build structures. We have to build structures quickly. We don't have the time to build slowly, and these structures necessarily will come out of the attempt to build fronts, of the attempt to gather the forces that we have, with the attempt to break down our walls, the walls between us, and build really an understanding and a mode of discussion that produces real new perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now asking. Well, let's have the following sequence. If we could have Comrade David Kaza to speak. By the way, Ed, you're very welcome to come in at any time. But then to be followed by Comrade Patrick, and then I think we may just be wanting to then have Comrade Andros make some points. Okay, Comrade Davis, please come in.
Thank you. Well, first I got to say about this document. I always the thing that Roger made a point about is that Wynne has not many others have this description of how the working class internationally has shifted as Wynne, and I think that is one of the best parts of this document. But what I was going to say just briefly is about, what really Wynne would need is some sort of collective international campaign, like some issue that we could that is of international significance that we could campaign with. If there's, like for us in Sweden and in Umeå, we have a group, we have like a pretty solid foundation, or in places where there's only individuals. some issue to sort of unite around. I mean, it could be in support for the Kurds in Rojava in northern Syria, for instance. It's, I mean, they were the ones who led the fight against the Islamic State, and they are owed a lot by people all over the world. Today, they are holding around 50,000 of these people from the Islamic State, both fighters and non-fighters, in prisons, and they are pretty much on their own. And they've been invaded and bombarded by Turkey in two waves, with pretty much no support. And during this earthquake that was in the beginning of this year, the Turkish state received a lot of aid from various governments, like from the European Union. Syria also received aid, but the Kurds in the Kurdish regions, they were only reliant on aid from individuals. So, I mean, supporting them, of course, it's a bigger issue perhaps here in Sweden, because the Swedish government a couple of years ago stopped exports to Turkey and started a collaboration with the PYD, the Kurdish, the main party of the Kurds in Rojava. And then now to join NATO and to appease the Turkish President Erdogan, the Swedish government has dropped all support for the Kurds, and even the current government even said they were distancing themselves from these organizations. That's one thing. Another thing is what we discussed yesterday about some sort of campaign that opposes both Putin and NATO, and for peace negotiations in Ukraine. I mean, that could be a powerful thing as well. And I mean, a lot of comrades were discussing this yesterday. A third idea now, I'm not sure about. I mean, the movement in Iran, like women, life, liberty, and freedom. I only know this thing, Xinjiang Azadi in Iranian. It's that could also be something. I don't have like a concrete proposal, but what WIN sort of needs. This is a very good document, but there's a need for something concrete. A campaign. I know when you hear stories from the CWI in the 70s, one like for the Swedish section had a very successful campaign. I think it was an international campaign as well, in support of the struggle against the Franco dictatorship in Spain. That was how the Social Democrats were recognizing the CWI members back then. They were campaigning in solidarity with Spain. Then they knew, aha, that was one of the things. So some sort of campaign. And then I just wanted to add, Jan wanted to make an addition to his contribution. He said that he forgot to mention that one sort of slogan to put forward in Sweden could be for the unions to call for the unions to form a new Labour Party. Yeah, right. Thank
you. Thanks, comrades. I don't know if please come forward, Patrick. Any other indications? But we are moving towards a conclusion. Well, not quite a conclusion. Let me put it this way: we're going to a kind of working lunch. Is the way I could put it. In other words, we're going to take lunch at 1 o'clock, and we're going to come back and watch some videos. Or as amended. As amended. Okay. All right. Anyway, there'll be no break as such. Well, no. In other words, the videos will come on, and we will get. Sorry. Yeah. No, well, look, understood, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, look, every comrade, we are not dictating every single to be in place, and we are not paying you $10 to sit on your seat, is what I've had in Africa. You know, in other words, you don't get your $10 unless you sit on that seat. We don't do that. No, look, comrades, come on. I think it's fine. Look, variants, all right, but there will be videos shown from 1 o'clock. Okay. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, thank you. Dave, first, Dave asked what's the difference between WIN and the USFI, and to me it's interesting because it raises a more principal question: who to discuss with and who to not discuss with. Where is there a possibility of a fruitful cooperation, and where is it no possibility? And I don't know about the USFI, but we have the section of the USFI in Sweden. And Swedish politics right now is that we have two social democratic parties. The first one is the old Social Democratic Party, and the other one is the old ex-communist party, now renamed to the Left Party. And then we have the USFI, and they now laid down they stopped their independent work and they joined the Left Party. And the underlying strategy right now of the Left Party is to join the government together with the Social Democrats. And the underlying strategy of the USFI is to join the leadership of the Left Party together and somehow join the government. And for instance, when the Social Democrats changed their views on joining NATO or not, it was more than 1 year ago, the Left Party said, well, we oppose the NATO, but we're not going to protest. Just so you know, that was their strategy, and it was based on the underlying strategy that they want to enter the government together with Social Democrats. And they knew if they were going to take any initiatives to have demonstrations, things like this, they would make themselves impossible in the government. When it comes to the USFI, there's a concrete example from our hometown, where the Social Democrats, which is the biggest party, they made a deal with one of the local, what's it called, fastighetsägarna, one of the big local capitalists, to co-finance a big building. And of course it was corruption involved. It ended up in the local capitalists getting money, actually. It was a way of, spending taxpayers' money to this capitalist. But they needed the Left Party to support them, otherwise the deal would not go through. And the Left Party said, yes, we'll do it. The USFI, who was within the Left Party, they said nothing. Actually, there was some honest working class members of the Left Party reacted. They couldn't stand the Left Party going with the Social Democrats on this. So they wanted to organize demonstrations. They tried to change the decision of the leadership of the Left Party. But the USFI immediately ended up together with the local leadership of the Left Party. They have a strategy of entering, cooperating very closely with the leadership of the Left Party. So for us, we don't think that it's a way forward to discuss with the USFI, because they don't want to create a new workers' party. They are quite
satisfied with the old so-called workers' parties. But about the USFI, I hope Roger can develop the points on this. But then I have, how much time do I have still? Another 5 minutes, okay. Okay, about the objective situation, there was in Roger's document, are we more like the first international or the third international? If you look at the kind of the objective situation, I think that now the end of the US century, so to say, it's coming to an end. China is rising. We see trade wars, we see protectionism, we even see real wars where Russia and NATO is, you know, closer to a head-to-head battle than ever. We see a swelling of military expenditure, we see cutbacks in healthcare and all these things, and we see a very volatile capitalism because of all these things. The period that we are entering is more like the period between 1914 and 1949, more like the period of the Third International. But on the other hand, the consciousness of the working class, I mean, in that period, the consciousness of the working class was inspired by the victorious Russian Revolution that showed that the working class can not only win a revolution, but also take the power of a state and even win against the armies of 11 other states. Of course, it gave self-confidence to a broad layer of workers. On the other hand, you had the defeats of Mussolini, of Franco, and in the end of Hitler in Germany, that also affected the consciousness of this period of the workers. Now we don't see any of these things. No revolutions, no victorious revolutions. There has been the growth of right-wing parties, even Nazi parties, but there has been no decisive defeats. Not even in Greece was there a decisive defeat for the working class. So it's more like we have a working class in the West that is affected by decades of retreat, not defeats, no decisive defeats, but retreats. And in the New World, which I also, it's very good that we point that out, but in the New World, we have a working class that is fresh, maybe the first generation of workers. But they are still, it's not the first international, because we have a history. If you go to China and talk to the workers and you say, we are a socialist organization, the workers will have some opinions about what is socialism. And that was not the case in 1850. So we have something new. I don't know what to call it, but it's hard to say. Is it the first international, the second international, or the third international? It's something new. But the important thing for us, of course, is to when we are now talking about building new international cooperations, again, is there a limitation on who to talk with? Well, I think there is a limitation. It won't be a fruitful cooperation if the ones that we are talking to have the strategy of going into a bourgeois government. Or on the other hand, if they are really sectarian and don't care about the workers' movement or the workers' struggles or anything like that, and they only want to sit in a room and discuss the Paris Commune several hundred years ago. So, thank you.
Apologies for a little over conversation on my side. Comrades, we are now drawing to close on this session. Andros, you're invited to come forward and to give some maybe some broad views on the debate. I would like to pick up a little of what Davos has mentioned, but not now, but in the subsequent discussion. So please keep your questions alive. There will be an answer to, well, I don't know the final answer, but anyway, some response to your points, Davos, at least from my side. Yeah. Oh, Trish, sorry, I didn't see that. Did you wish to indicate? Or are you indicating? No, okay, all right. You're a little shy, but please. And by the way, you're welcome to come in later in the session after 2 o'clock. Okay, yeah. Andras?
Comrades, before this discussion, Nigel and myself had kind of agreed that we would not intervene in this discussion because we thought it was a kind of internal discussion for WIN, discussing about whether it would want to develop in the direction of a more organized international current or tendency rather than just a network. But then comrades Roger and David insisted that we should give some impression. So that's why I'm here. In next session, Nigel will give a short history of how we came here, how international standpoint developed through the crisis of the CWI. So I hope at the end of this, comrades will have a clearer picture of what we are and what we say. I think we are discussing about the piston or about the catalyst, which means that we cannot just discuss. We need to discuss and do things. We need to widen our impact, and that's the way to become a catalyst. There are certain lines that have to be drawn. I am very much in agreement with the points that Comrade Patrick has just mentioned. We cannot just be a discussion group to bring everybody to discuss everything just because we want to be broader. There's no point in having sectarians in our ranks because they are an obstacle to the development of the movement. We need to have a clear orientation to the mass movement, to the working class, and to the understanding of the of how will the hundreds of thousands and the millions be conquered. We're not interested in living in circles of our own, discussing between ourselves, and be happy with raising revolutionary ideas. We don't want to cross the line of opportunism. So forces that have shown to be opportunist, which is clearly manifested in the cases of anti-capitalist organizations or Trotskyist organizations in name, they are ready to enter governments. So we have to narrow the limits if we want the piston to be effective, because there is a lot of steam. I agree very much with the parallel. There is a lot of steam on the globe, on a global scale, but the piston is missing, and it's not an easy task to build it. If it was easy, it could have been done. If I were to make a mention on the document, which I think it's a very good document, written by Roger, I would say that we, from our point of view as international standpoint, would like to see a more detailed elaboration of the complications of the epoch, on the difficulties of the epoch, because everything that the document says is correct, but then we have obstacles on our way. What are these obstacles? What is creating them? There is a massive retreat in consciousness. I'm again echoing Patrick on this. How is it explained? How will it be overcome? I think some further development of these points would make the document richer and help more in providing a direction about the work of our forces. So in the kind of widening our impact and inviting forces to join, we should exclude sectarianism, we should exclude opportunism, and we should exclude the top-down bureaucratic centralist approach that we see not just in the CWI, but in most of the Trotskyist and anti-capitalist organizations. This is a tragic feature of the anti-capitalist left. In the CWI, those of us who could see the problem over the past decades were hoping that we would be able at some stage to overcome it. And it proved impossible. So one of the key features of trying to widen our impact by unifying forces to the biggest possible extent, let me put it in that way, is that we need to make sure that they have a proper understanding of internal democracy and a proper understanding of democratic centralism, because what we see today in the anti-capitalist left is that in the name of democratic centralism, they are applying bureaucratic centralism and messianism. Each and every one of these groups, well, not every single one, but the majority, they think that they possess the absolute truth and that they are the center of the future of the working class, and without them, the planet cannot go round. And this, of course, is ridiculous. In any attempt to get together and develop common work with any organization, there are bound to be differences. Any attempt to think that we can find the organization in which there is 100% agreement is non-realistic. So we have to see if there is agreement on the fundamentals, and then discuss the differences, the different emphasis, and in a balanced and a careful way. And we can agree and go forward on what is common, as long as there is agreement on the principles that I mentioned before, and allow for the different opinions or approaches that may exist. Oh, I only got 2 minutes? Okay. To be expressed not only internally, but also in public. We shouldn't be afraid that if we are able to create a stronger, unified international catalyst in the next period, there are bound to be differences. So we shouldn't be afraid if they are expressed in public between different comrades. I wouldn't see any problem if, for example, on our website, we had comrades who think that the Chinese state is a hybrid, or the Chinese state has crossed the qualitative stage of being fundamentally capitalist. That can be discussed forever in a very beneficial theoretical and historical discussion on our websites in public. Or if there are some differences on perspectives. Some comrades think it's more optimistic, other comrades think it's more complicated, the situation, globally or nationally. Or even on tactics. There can be an open discussion on different tactical approaches we may have. This is not theory, just to strengthen this a little bit. I come from the Greek section and international standpoint, but in the Greek section, we had a tradition for about 15 years of encouraging members with a different position from the leadership of the organization to express them openly. I think we are the only organization in Greece that does that, and one of the very few internationally. So if the Central National Committee or the Congress takes a decision, but there are comrades who don't agree with it, they have the freedom to raise their difference publicly on the website of the organization. This has never caused a problem. On the contrary, I think that the fact that our Ξεκίνημα, the Greek organization, has not had a split in the last 25 years is because of this. Because when you don't suppress a different opinion, it has no reason to go. Of course, some comrades will always go, but it's individuals for whatever reason. But it doesn't cause frictions and clashes internally. So I think that through our very different roles, and by the way, this idea is now applied because it's in agreement with the rest of the comrades in international standpoint. The idea of freely expressing different opinions within the membership, between individual comrades, but between organizations as well. I think, therefore, that we have arrived through different roads to very similar conclusions with WIN. Both on the political, theoretical analysis perspectives and tasks, but also on the way, let's call it the regime. It's fundamental, the regime. In parentheses, I would say that none of the splits of the CWI, in my opinion, was ever justified on the political differences. Most of them had to do with the regime, which did not accept to be in a minority or to be questioned. And that, unfortunately, is not only a characteristic of the CWA, which, in my opinion, unfortunately, is not finished. So we came into contact with WIN through this way. But once we came out of the ISA in the middle of 2021, we searched for groups who might be thinking in similar terms internationally. And there are groups. We now have important contacts with organizations in Latin America that we think will become fruitful at some stage. There is no hurry, no pressure. We have to give things time. Very good developments in Italy with some of the myriad of splinter groups that came out of the collapse of the ex-Communist Party. There are many people who are arriving to similar conclusions like ours. And I'm not saying it's going to be a rosy way forward. Things will be, it's going to be difficult. But the possibilities are there. And the main thing is to respect differences, not to launch a war when different opinions emerge. But on the contrary, use them, not in words, but in practice, to deepen the understanding of everybody. Are there red lines? I mentioned the red lines before. I said again that they're very similar to what Patrick said, but David asked a question about the USFI. The USFI, unfortunately, doesn't have the red lines which are necessary. So you can have balanced people, organizations, sectarian groups, opportunist groups. Patrick gave some examples from Sweden, but David wasn't here. But if I give an example, the USFI in Brazil in the previous decade, when their section entered the government of Lula, so we had a revolutionary organization entering the government of Lula. The leadership of the USFI didn't take a position for something like 5 years. I mean, I'm not saying they should immediately expel them, but take a position. And when the leader of the USFI was in Greece for a visit and we met, I asked him, so why don't you state something about Brazil? He said, well, it's a tactical issue. Well, it's not a tactical issue, but even if it is a tactical issue, it's an important tactical issue. And the USFI should have taken a position. So we want a catalyst or a piston, but this cannot be a place where we just meet, everybody talks, and then goes home and do whatever they want, contradicting each other, and therefore exposing themselves. Actually, in the middle of July, there was a meeting in Milan, which was open to all anti-capitalist organizations and international currents, and we were there. It was a good meeting. We met people. We exchanged ideas and information, and this is always useful. But it's not a catalyst. It's not the piston that we want to build. It's a meeting like in a coffee shop or in a wine bar, we drink and we talk, and it's good, but it's not the piston. So I think that we should aim to draw the lines that allow us to come together, people who want to come together and agree, but be able to have an impact and play a role. I've gone over my time, so I have to stop. We cannot decide on this now, but maybe an idea is that after this conference, the WIN comrades, they elect a small committee, and international standpoint, elect a small committee, and they come together to form like a working commission to discuss details, political details, practical details, see how we can proceed, if we can proceed. I am very optimistic.